it's funny, you know, things have changed so much with time. And if I ever doubted that, I don't now. I don't. You know, last November, barely 10 months ago, I addressed the PACT reception. PACT actually stands for, sorry, PACT actually stands for People Acting in Community Together. And so I was addressing that reception as an honoree. And I said I wanted to talk about something that was very deeply personal and important to me, because I'd gotten to the point where I knew that certain things had to be said, and they had to be said out loud. I talked about the fact that I had moments when I struggled to find my voice. Some people actually found that hard to believe, including my husband. I guess I understand why. But anyway, I decided that this was it. You know, I could no longer stay silent, even under the potential that I would surely make a few people uncomfortable, if not angry. So I mustered up the courage to speak my truth because the stakes were high, not for me, but for my grandchildren and their children. So, you know, I did what we say in Silicon Valley. I leaned in. And I said it. Silicon Valley is a beautiful place, full of opportunity and technological breakthroughs. I feel privileged to have lived here for 40 years. But in case you haven't heard, we have a problem with race. The room was silent. But part of the problem is that we don't want to believe that there's a problem, and we don't like to talk about it. We never have. It's uncomfortable, but necessary. And we don't have the skills to talk about it, but I believe we can learn. And of course, I realize it's not just a problem here, but this is where I live after all, and common wisdom is that we first have to take care of things at home. I'm not talking about politics. I'm talking about people and the way we treat each other. I'm talking about respecting differences, even if we don't agree or understand. But at least let's try to understand. I'm talking about what Anna mentioned, the right to a quality education, a safe place to live, the ability to work in a place that is inclusive and values your talent as a person, a human being, values your talent and your contribution, regardless of the color of your skin or where you come from or what you look like. Silicon Valley is known for getting things done that are important. We are the land of innovation, right? We invent things, we change whole systems, we change lives. In Silicon Valley, our diversity shouldn't be a problem. It's the gift that should be embraced, cultivated, and celebrated. It should be our superpower. And I know having the right people in the room, I know that we talk about this all the time. Having the right people in the room is important. And it does enrich the experience and the conversation and the solution. And we all know diversity at its best, when you can be authentic, it truly is at its best. And being able to bring our whole selves into a room. But, you know, I think we need to move on to bigger and better ideas than just letting people in the room. Where's the conversation that inspires others to be a part of the solution? How do we make tomorrow be better than today? In 1970, my father had a talk with my then 16-year-old brother about policemen. We call it the talk in Black families. If you're ever stopped, keep your eyes straight ahead, your hands on the wheel, and don't argue. Years later, we had that same conversation with our sons. Now we're still having the same conversation with our grandsons. In 1982, upon placing an offer on our home here in Los Altos Hills, we were told Los Altos Hills wasn't ready for a Black family. Within a year, I was followed by a policeman one day through Stanford University campus and pulled over because he didn't believe that I could own a Mercedes and questioned the validity of the address on my license. That's code for driving while being Black. I could go on, but you get the idea, I think. Anyway, that was a little over 9 months ago. I thought I was being courageous. Fast forward. We in this great country are in the middle of the fight for our lives as we know it, or as we thought it was. We have the pandemic of a deadly virus, and the pandemic of racism. I know you've heard that phrase, and I believe it so strongly. The scientists and great minds will discover a vaccine, I'm sure of it. It's just a matter of time. As it relates to the devastation of systemic and structural racism, this moment gives me pause, but also hope. People give me hope. But I'm worried. I'm confounded. I'm angry, and I'm sad. I want so much more for our children. Don't you? We all do. And that's why we have to get better at having the tough conversation, because healing our bodies won't mean much in a divided world full of hate, anger, and apathy. So I'm asking that we each do everything we can to educate ourselves and each other on the subject of race, the value of inclusivity, and the power of belonging, because I believe we're so much better than this. We all have to be more deliberate in our thoughts, words, and actions. And if we are, I believe, and it has been proven, that we can be successful beyond measure. I can't ask you to be braver in addressing this issue without harnessing new courage myself. And so I'm asking that each of you discover your place in the issue of race. And for some of you to say what people of color get persecuted for saying, because when you say it, it's heard differently. So we all need to find and use our voices. We have the power and the responsibility. You know, you don't have to be a bad person to be a part of the problem, right? Things happen. And you don't have to be a hero or an activist to be a part of the solution. We just have to do something, say something. And that's the other thing that gives me hope. Last November, this was a one-off topic. Now, thanks to the hard work and commitment of so many really courageous people of all colors and nationalities, we're talking about it all the time. And the talking is turning into action. Let's not squander this moment. This amazing opportunity to truly create change is here before us. So consider this my call to action. And I will end my comments with a quote from Rosa Parks, who said, "To bring about change, you must not be afraid to take the first step. We only fail when we fail to try." So thank you. And now, I just wanted to make sure that I have what I need here. Now I'd like to add my welcome to all of you this morning. And my congratulations for the fact that you're participating in this forum today. I know that conversations like these are, and specifically conversations of race, again, because we're all learning together, can be uncomfortable. And that's okay. That's really okay. But that's because we haven't had enough practice, and I've been complicit in that until last November. But we need to have these conversations. So the next hour isn't about laying blame or making anyone feel badly, or to make anyone feel good for that matter. This conversation is about sharing perspectives, learning, and understanding. So together, we can all be better. So we'll begin our journey of understanding by listening to our three very special panelists, Jackie Copeland, founder of Black Philanthropy Month, and founder CEO of the Weiss Fund. Harold Roundtree, President CEO of Uncle Credit Union. And James Head, President CEO of the East Bay Community Foundation. We will listen as they share their stories, not their bios. You have access to their bios. You have that online. But these are stories that will help to shape your understanding of who they are, which will build context for why they do what they do, how they choose to show up in this world, and why they're here today, in this moment, having this dialogue at this time. So Jackie, I'll start with you.
Okay. First, I'd like to thank you, Caritha, for inviting me and recognize the Tri-Valley Nonprofit Alliance for convening this forum, this community conversation about the elephant in the room. America's original sin that we're still trying to deal with to this day. And I am here essentially at 35 years in my career as a human rights and social justice advocate. And like a lot of people who choose this path, there's a convergence of personal, community, and professional experiences that have led me here. I will say a bit about the Weiss Fund and Black Philanthropy Month before sharing the story. And, you know, all our stories have a lot to them, so I'll try to keep it short. But Black Philanthropy Month is a global celebration and promotion of African descent giving in all of its forms that I founded in 2011, largely because due to racial stereotypes, Black people are often seen as the supplicants of the US and the world, whereas the truth is 30 years worth of research consistently has proven that we give the highest proportion of our income in philanthropy in a nation. And that's consistent year to year. We're the only group that typically increases its giving in a time of recession. COVID might be different. And it's been wonderful to convene African descent people from around the world, 17 million so far. And to really be part of the movement to increase and coordinate strategic giving to address some of the systemic challenges facing Black communities everywhere. I'm very concerned about the environment and created the Women Invested to Save Earth Fund to deal with the fact that not only do we have a global warming challenge and environmental racism that's affecting the entire planet, but when you look at the statistics, communities of color across the world that are also the most environmentally stressed communities in the world find that their innovators only get less than 1% of the funding for their efforts, their organizations in either the business or the nonprofit sector. And so we find and fund Black and Indigenous women innovators, technologists working on climate change issues. And so these are the two ways that I'm trying to pay it forward at this point in my career. My career is about paying it forward because frankly, I grew up living a lot of the stories and statistics in the US. My family, on my mother's side, is from South Carolina. Gullah Geechee people, for those of you who know about Low Country history, part of the Great Migration came to Philadelphia with a very strong belief in education. And I speak very frankly now. That's sort of my, like Caretha was saying, I have to give testimony and let people know that people who are very successful are also equally endangered. And I use that term deliberately, by the ongoing systemic racism of this country that reaches our families. And I grew, or my family was escaping the South, looking for opportunity in the North. And my mother told me, you make sure you get every degree that the white man will let you have from the best schools possible. So people often ask, well, why do you have 5 Ivy League degrees? She also said you have to be twice as good to get half as much. And so our family approach was to ensure that we were deeply educated, so that when people saw me and made certain knee-jerk assumptions about my lack of qualifications, the hope was that the empirical evidence would be the education. That hasn't always turned out to be the case, and I've had to be an advocate for myself and others in terms of career, pay, equal access to healthcare at this very same time that I've had a great deal of success. So I consider myself a survivor of America's racial caste system, and it has very deeply sensitized me to human rights abuses. And I've dedicated my life to racial justice issues, but also justice issues for other ostracized communities, including women, LGBTQI or queer people, as well as advocating for our planet. I think that the coronavirus and this recession is a wake-up call for the US and the planet that gives us an opportunity to face the realities of the work that we still all need to do to ensure that we're living up to the principles of our democracy that we all aspire to, and that human rights, not just civil rights, but these are basic human rights. The racism that continues is a basic human rights abuse, that all Americans, all people, regardless of their national origin or background, simply can live. That's what's at stake here for my brother, for my nephew, for the Black people that I love and we all know. I know that I am not safe when I walk out of my home, and it doesn't matter how many degrees I have or what I have done for the community. And I frankly have a sense of very righteous indignation. I have a 30-year-old daughter. I've been involved as an advocate for a long, long time. And I did not think that at this point in my life as an almost 60-year-old, that I would still be fighting these battles. It's wrong. It is, we can do much better, especially Silicon Valley. There's a recent report that came out that the largest 10 technology companies in Silicon Valley have no Black women hired. That's no Black women. This is a study by San Jose State University. And that means not in janitorial, not in executive, just no Black women. And sometimes it's not deliberate, it's just that people have turned a blind eye. And so therefore the century-old, I'm not even going to call it implicit biases because that's kind of too soft, racism, and in this case, sexism, conspire to sustain the same track record that we've been talking about actually for decades. And so with 1/3 of the corona deaths in the US being Black, 46% of small to medium-sized Black businesses closing, an escalating 25% unemployment rate of Black people. It is 56% unemployment rate for Black men in Oakland. We have to decide what we are going to do, and we're talking about Silicon Valley with all of the brilliance here. We should be able to innovate our way out of racism. And if we don't, it is because we've decided that we don't want to. It's not rocket science. We're changing with artificial intelligence, even what it is to be a human being in Silicon Valley. We can do this. I appreciate this forum and an opportunity after the forum to talk about what we can do constructively to truly create an equitable, inclusive community for all people. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Jackie. I look forward to more of your comments and digging deeper on this discussion with you. Harold.
Okay, I'll take my mic off for you. I want to thank the Tri-Valley Nonprofit Alliance for the invite today. I see some familiar faces out there as I've on my journey as I celebrate 9 years at Uncle Credit Union as a CEO. I have the unique opportunity, if you can hear me okay, everybody okay? I have the unique opportunity of I actually live and work in the same area. I have lived in Pleasanton for the last 20 years. And I'm just going to talk about my journey here, who I am, for those of you that may want to know, and I'll try to share some of those things along the way, some of the things as Ms. Copeland and I had talked about initially. I grew up in Berkeley, California, so I'm not from the South. I am the product of a mom and a dad that I pay tremendous homage to that lived in Louisiana and Texas and migrated here in the to California. I am the fourth of 5 kids. I am considered an uh-oh to those folks. They had 3 kids and they stopped. And then my brother and I came along as the uh-ohs. And so, but I don't like to refer to myself as an uh-oh, but they just were fantastic folks. And my parents were hardworking folks. They worked, my dad worked at the post office in San Francisco. My mom worked as a cook at UC Berkeley. And the one thing that they promoted was hard work. I grew up in Berkeley was a fantastic area. I enjoyed my time. I was born in the same house, went to school in that house, and waited as long as I could before I left that house. Once I got married, I had to leave, unfortunately, but it was a lot of fun staying there that time. In that journey, I actually went to school at Boise State in Boise, Idaho. I got a full athletic scholarship to play football there. And at that time in Boise, that was several, in the 70s, we'll call it. Boise was known as a different community, a predominantly Caucasian community. And as I went to that school, I'd love to be able to tell you all the stories of this, that, and the other, but I was embraced in that environment. My mom and dad, as Ms. Coleman mentioned, they were terrified that I'd go to school there and what would happen to me and the like. And I can honestly tell you that I had a tremendous amount of fun and I should have studied a little harder, but that's another story. As I came back here and finished my undergrad school at Cal State East Bay, or Cal State Hayward, I like to call it. We'll call it East Bay for the audience here. I left that at school on a Friday in the 70s, and I started my career at First Interstate Bank on a Monday. And I've been working at it for the last 41 years. And when I went into financial services, I was told by a lot of people, hey, that is an environment that you're not going to get very far in. It's not a lot of African Americans and the like. And I have simply put my head down and put one foot in front of the other. I've been told along the way, you'll never go past this stage or that stage. But whenever I've been given an opportunity, I have jumped at it. That's with a bank that had some 27,000 employees in it at the time, First Interstate Bank, which is now part of Wells. I worked at World Savings. That was a $40 billion bank that doesn't exist. It's part of Wells. I had a chance to work in the Silicon Valley for Technology Credit Union. I was there for 17 years. And always along the way, I was always one. There was just a handful of folks there. But, and sometimes you do some of the things that you may not want to do to get promoted in a career. A lot of times, well, maybe you should do collections. Credit really wouldn't be your kind of thing. But but those opportunities, again, every time I had an opportunity, I took the assignment to learn. I got paid with experience, and that has allowed me to. It's helped me personally. It's helped me professionally in my career along the way. I was thinking along of some of those journeys. I remember working for First Interstate Bank. I'm fresh out of college. I'm off the officer development program, and I'm sitting in a branch. And the biggest deal there was to look at folks that had overdrawn their checking account. And my job was to see who I would pay that check for and who we wouldn't pay that check for. Today, that's an automated feature. I don't get to do that anymore. It's all automated. But it was a big deal at the bank. And I remember sitting in the branch in Alameda. And remember, Alameda was, hey, you better be out of Alameda by sundown because, you know, it had different preferences for people. I never had a problem there. I had a lot of fun there too. But it was interesting. The member walked in. He says, hey, you returned my check. And I said, I did. I said, you seem to be a little bit overextended and we need you to make those funds good. And he looked at me and he said, you know, he said, I remember when people like you were not allowed to clean this building. How dare you bounce my check? And I replied in a good-hearted manner. I said, that was then, this is now, when are you going to bring us some money so we can get back to business? But you would hear those kinds of things along the way. And it was unfortunate. And again, as my mom and dad, who had made this great migration here, had told me, you know, you don't want to work in that environment. But again, putting one foot in front of the other, keeping my head down, keeping it going was the way to do it. I had heard, with my mom and dad, again, being a postal clerk and a cook, they had not finished college, but they encouraged us to go to college. And I got an undergrad degree from Cal State East Bay after finishing school there, as I mentioned. I went to Golden Gate University at night to get an MBA because I knew that the more education I had, that if two people were at the table, that could be the differentiator for me. I can remember a story of working at First Interstate Bank, and luckily that company reimbursed you when you went back to school. I had a boss at the time, and he said, you know, Golden Gate University is just a local school. You're wasting your time. You don't need to go to that school. It's never going to do anything for you. And I'd have to go in there every time I got my grade and get them to sign off on my tuition. It sort of went in one ear and out the other because he was also one of those guys that said, you'll never do more than what you're doing here. This is the end of the road for you. I got that. But again, using the system at the time to continue to promote myself and move along, it went that way. When I decided to move here to the Tri-Valley, I always liked Pleasanton. It was always a great area. And when I married my spouse, she thought we were living in Hayward at the time, and she thought that the Tri-Valley was a better place before we started a family. And I says, oh, okay. I remember telling my mom and sister, and they said, oh, God, if you move to the Tri-Valley, there's no African Americans there. It's going to be a terrible experience. Oh, just terrible. But we simply made the move. We just thought it made a lot of sense. We raised our two girls here locally. They went to Foothill, and they got excellent educations there. So far as their friends and the like, it was a mix of different friends in that particular area. But I don't have a story of something terrible that has happened along those lines. I've had good neighbors along the way. And I've had an opportunity to serve here with various chambers in Pleasanton and here in Livermore, and to have a career that has helped me. The one thing that I do believe is that it's important in my sphere of influence to encourage people to step out and do those things that they can't control, and that is to go back to school and get as much education as you can. I think I am 100% on board with that methodology. I think it's very important that we do some of the very basics. We're on the heels of a very huge election. And in my sphere of influence, particularly to the millennials and the younger folks, to my daughters and to others, I'm encouraging people to get out and to vote because I think that that is important to people. So many people, oh, I don't want to vote. My vote doesn't count. But my mom and dad had told me the stories about voting in the South and what it was like, the litmus test to vote in those in their communities that they had come from. So I think if I agree with making changes, but if we do a crawl, walk, run of just the basics, is to participate, to vote, to continue to get your education that you possibly can. And when given an opportunity, no matter what that opportunity is, you want to make sure you perform and get your job done and to promote the organization that you work for, not to badmouth the organization that is there, and to take any morsel of opportunity and to move along in that particular area. When I applied for this particular job, I thought it was, hey, will you get the job? Will you not get the job? What kind of boss is he going to be? And I tend to believe that I want to treat people as I would be treated. I try to use a very basic formula to be an honest person, to be a forthright person, and to be consistent. And that is my story that I wanted to share in my opening comments of my journey here to live and work in the Tri-Valley. I love California, and I think it's a great area. I think it has changed over the 60 plus years that I've been on this earth, and again, that I've seen it. And I look forward to, I know we're all leaning in. I know a lot of things have happened, and we're leaning in to learn ways to make it a better place. Thank you.
Thank you, Harold. I look forward to continuing the conversation with you as well. And now we have, last but not least, James Head. James?
Thank you, Caritha. And let me first also thank the Tri-Valley Nonprofit Alliance for the opportunity to be with you. And I'm excited about being on the panel with both Jackie and Harold. In terms of a story, and I'll be brief, actually, what you find, and I think it's been consistent in what Jackie and Harold said, is this connection to the South for many of us. And Jackie, having grown up in Georgia and having spent some time in South Carolina, I am very much aware of the culture of South Carolina, and especially the coastal culture that you mentioned. And so brings back memories. For me, as Caritha indicated, I'm the president and CEO at the East Bay Community Foundation, and we cover actually Alameda and Contra Costa County. And I've been CEO for almost 6 years now. And as a social justice, civil rights, public interest lawyer by profession, what I have attempted to do with a board of directors and board of trustees at the foundation is really to have the foundation focus a lot more attention on the issues of social justice in the East Bay. And I think we're making some headway, and we therefore were, I think, as prepared as you could be for the racial and income disparities that COVID-19 brought, as well as the social justice protests that we are continuing to see. We focused in our COVID-19 effort in terms of getting donors to really be active in responding on those who were most vulnerable, for example, immigrants who were not going to be eligible for stimulus resources from the federal government. We actually created a COVID-19 fund in which our board of directors took $1 million out of our endowment to leverage almost $7 million from donors, corporations, and others. And that $8 million is now going towards those who have income needs, resource needs. And so that's been really important. And much of that direction is about making the foundation not just a transactional institution for donors and for our grantees, but actually to make it a transformational institution for the community. The story I guess I would share is I'm a lawyer, as I said, by profession, 40 plus years, licensed in actually Georgia, Florida, and California. And as I was coming out of high school, my mom made a decision when we were entering high school to have us actually be part of the first group of African Americans to integrate the high school in Georgia that we were in a small rural town about 40 miles south of Atlanta. And one, I didn't want to go because all of my friends were in the Black high school. And neither of my brothers wanted to go. It was me and my three brothers, along with a number of other Black kids. And my mom decided that we should go because she thought we were ready to withstand what would come at us as part of the first group of Blacks to integrate. But actually, my mom caught sort of resistance around this from both the white community, who did not want Black kids in the school, and she also caught a fair amount of flack from the Black community, who accused her of feeling like her kids were too good to be in the Black high school. But regardless of that, she decided to have us go. As I was graduating from high school, my counselor, who was white, made the suggestion when I indicated that I wanted to go to the University of Georgia, which was the state school in Georgia, that I shouldn't consider the University of Georgia. He thought that I was much more suited for a Black college, even though I actually had been accepted to a Black college as part of a high school college program. I had been accepted to Morehouse College actually my junior year, but decided not to go because I wanted to finish my senior year. And like Harold, I was an athlete and played basketball. And I wanted to go to the University of Georgia because I wanted to be a lawyer. And secondly, because I had played basketball and had gotten a couple of scholarships, I was contemplating trying out for the basketball team at the University of Georgia. And so when the counselor told me that he thought I should not apply and shouldn't go, when my mom heard of it, as those of you who know mothers who were determined, she decided to take off from work, went directly to the high school, and confronted the counselor and basically told the counselor that I was going to go where I wanted to go, whether he liked it or not. And in the conversation after that, my mom told me something that I've always remembered, and it was, don't let anybody tell you what you can't do. And that's been my mantra, as I've gone on in my profession and in doing what I do. I think that, growing up in the South really did prepare me for the issues of race, of racism that I've seen over my years as a lawyer doing public interest work in a rural southern town in Georgia. I was representing a white client in a divorce matter pro bono because I was working for legal services and we did not charge. And I showed up for court in the small town. I had a suit on with my briefcase. My client, who was white, had an open collar shirt and blue jeans. And the bailiff actually asked me if I was the defendant in the case. And so those things actually, for me, were lessons. I didn't get mad. I basically informed them who I was and why I was there. But it was something that, stuck with me, and I've shared with young people over the years so that they really understand sometimes that the issues of race and racism are both a policy issue, but they're also ingrained in people. And it is the hearts and minds of people that I think that we have to sort of really look to change. I think that there are things that are happening today that that we're involved in at the foundation, and I want to share because I think they're important. And we'll get us closer to where Caretha really talked about we need to be. One of them is that we actually are working on both Prop 15 and Prop 16, which are on the ballot for this fall. And Prop 15, if you don't know, it's called the Schools and Communities First Initiative. It will actually revise Prop 13, the tax issues of Prop 13 as it relates to commercial property, will correct those in a way in which the state will get anywhere from $8 to $12 billion a year in the general fund that can then go directly to counties that can then go directly to the nonprofit sector and to services for those that are most vulnerable and that we care about. Prop 16 actually would repeal the anti-affirmative action amendment that was passed some 24 plus years ago and would allow for affirmative action to be defined actually by the federal standard versus the state standard, which would again open up public resources for contracting for businesses of color and open up our schools in a way in which they are much more equitable to those who have been traditionally shut out of those schools because of racist policies that have existed. And so I think that those two will go a long way towards getting us to where we want to be. I agree with Harold on the election. I think that it is critically important, although I worry less about California, and I think we should look at some of the states that are key states in terms of what's necessary and needed, and I hope that we can do that. There's one thing that I do as a lawyer would want to again stress to all of us, which is what is key, I think, for many people who are supporting the current occupants of the White House and the administration, is this idea of getting one additional Supreme Court justice appointed who has much more of a conservative approach. And if that happens, I think that laws to support those of us who are most vulnerable and those of us in terms of color, ethnicity, religion are likely to suffer. We are all likely to suffer for the next 25 to 30 years. And so that is a really key component for me and reason that we need to make sure this election moves us in the right direction. So I'll stop there.
James, thank you for your comments, and I couldn't agree more relative to what you were saying. Again, we don't want this to necessarily be a political discussion, but unfortunately, part of the reason we are and others are in this place at this moment is because it was a very systematic approach. And Jackie mentioned part of that as well. So we can talk about that a little bit if people are interested. The other thing I just wanted to mention, if you've been looking at your chat, I know Steve has mentioned a couple of times that we will have a Q&A session at the end. But if you have a question for one of the panelists in the interim, please just put it on the chat, and Steve or Kathy or Anna will catch it, and we will interrupt or intervene in the moment. So we're good with that because this is your conversation as well. So for the three of you, as I listened to all of you, and one of the things that I think there was a common thread about was the fact that I'm going to oversimplify it, but the fact that we, in our daily lives, are confronted by certain issues relative to how we look and how we show up. And that what we tend to do is we keep our head down and we do our work, and we hope that, you know, someone will notice and that you will have the right leader who is going to reward you and make sure that they bring you along as well. And so there's a big leap of faith there, but just to, I guess, emphasize the fact, I know that there's been a lot of jargon thrown around over these last few months, And one of those terms is around microaggressions. And so it's not always this big thing that happens to a person of color or to a Black person as they're walking down the road or as they're stopped by a policeman. It's not always a big thing. But the little things really add up. And on a daily basis, these microaggressions, these experiences that happen, build up over time. And it makes it very hard. But if you, as a Black person, carried this on your shoulder every single day, you wouldn't get out of bed. You know, at some point you have to set it aside so that you can get on about your business and do your work and be your best and try to put that one foot in front of the other. So it's just something that I wanted to add. And for the three of you, I'd like for you to share what you hope will come out of not just today, but out of this moment that we're in, because I think that we all, including the people in the audience, are wanting to ensure that we don't squander this moment, this opportunity, if you will, because we do have some unintended positive consequences, right? Part of it is that there is this heightened sense of interest in this issue. There's a heightened sense of responsibility that people feel, regardless of the color of your skin. Those things are very, very meaningful. So what do you hope an outcome or outcomes are of this moment that we're in? And what are you concerned about? And what are you frustrated about? And what are you hopeful about? James, you want to start?
Sure. You know, it's hard to think about fully what can come out of this moment, because I think in many ways we learn and we change sort of in stages. And so part of it for me is the hope that that this becomes a moment of sort of inter-reflection for all of us around issues of race and how race plays a part in what we do, and not just personally in how we interact, but also in what policies that are currently there. I would strongly recommend to those who have not read a book by Dr. Ibram Kendi, and the title of it is How to Be an Anti-Racist. And it is his journey as an individual Black man through beginning to understand how his upbringing and how the views that he was exposed to created for him, actually as an African American man, racial tendencies. And actually they were not so much racial tendencies towards whites, but actual racial tendencies towards Blacks. How he would, if there was a news article about a robbery, how his first impression was to say, I hope it wasn't a Black man. And he's very instructive in how policies actually influence how we think, how we act, and what we do. And he's also very, I think, encouraging in that we all can change if we accept that's where we are headed and what we need to do. And that's probably also my biggest fear. My biggest fear is that we will get into an argument that I've seen over my lifetime from people who will say, I'm not a racist. And you hear this now, not a racist, policies aren't racist, people are self-determined. And so if Black men end up getting killed by police, it's because they've done something that has provoked that. And I think that we just need to really fully challenge that thinking and those issues. And lastly, that I as a Black man can't do that by myself, and Black people can't do that as a people by ourselves. And we need our white brothers and sisters to step forward to really join in those dialogue and conversations. And we need our Latinx and our Asian and Pacific Islander brothers and sisters to join us, because we are all very much, battling the same things in terms of treatment. So that's kind of where I am, and that's a little bit Pollyannish probably and utopia oriented, but I think we have an opportunity to begin to move much more in that direction.
Well, we have to have goals, right? That's the other thing. So I don't think it's Pollyannish at all. Jackie, anything to add to that?
Yeah, it is a, in some ways familiar, but unprecedented historical moment. I want to affirm everything that James stated. My hope is that the very unfortunate public lynching and murder of George Floyd has helped people across the world have a sense of empathy with the very warranted concerns that we have as Black people, men, women, parents, not parents, that one day's microaggression might easily escalate within minutes to serious injury or loss of life. You do have to develop coping mechanisms so you can continue to perform and live, but it is a traumatic, I think, reality of being Black in America and in many places. And that is for people who do everything right. Often there is this assumption that those who are discriminated against lack some qualification or did something criminal, but this is a reality of people like those on the panel, and certainly myself and my children, who just get caught in the ongoing crosshairs of racism. And it's not as if people, and I'm just going to speak from a personal perspective, often you're shell shocked when it happens because it's not what you expect. You're just walking, minding your business, doing your job. But all of these incidents add up to the empirical reality that we see in the indicators. There's still a contingent out there that believes that racial disparities are a result of our intellectual and general inferiority. And I'm just going to name that. So I think a lot of what has to be done, and I love Facing History's concept of being an upstander, because it really does, and I use it a lot because it helps. This is in some ways, when we encounter racism, it's a form of bullying. And it's in those individual acts as an employer, as just a person living their lives regardless of your background. How are you going to make sure, all of us, that we are not part of the problem? Even for people who work on these issues full time, I think it's really important to ensure that we're walking the talk of equity in our daily lives and interactions with people, because that's how history and these statistics are made, over the millions of interactions every single day. And then they boil up into the hands of powerful people in the populace and become policy. And so I think the civil rights movement changed laws, but not people's hearts. And it's time for people to decide whether they just want to treat people who happen to have darker skin or were born someplace else or loved differently as human beings. I think that's what it essentially boils down to. A book that I would recommend that is very helpful, I think, for people who don't have this as their lived experience in particular, is a book called Bias by a Stanford professor, Jennifer Eberhardt. And it explains how history and contemporary racism can create sort of this almost invisible knee-jerk sense that Black people are dangerous. And it's not just men. A lot of us are trying to get attention for Breonna Taylor as well. It's also our children who are over-disciplined in school and often physically harmed. And so it's a great book that explains how good people can do racist things, because anti-Black racism in particular is part of our heritage as Americans.
Right.
And it's sad, but this, I hope, is a moment where more everyday people are talking about it and frankly just sick of it. And wouldn't it be easier to live as an American if we really, none of us, Black, white, Latino, anyone else, had to address this issue because we were just treating each other as people, because it's just hard to live now anyway with the coronavirus and this recession. So I would say let's do our own individual parts to ensure that we're making racism history. And it means we have to talk about it and stop telling people it's a figment of their imagination or that they have a chip on their shoulder. And I think all of us are saying is you can have success. We all work hard, we all do the right thing and still be oppressed by racism. The two can go together. It's not an either or. Right. So thanks to everyone joining the conversation so we can all do better together.
And Jackie, it was great that you mentioned Jennifer's book, Bias, and Jennifer and her husband are both wonderful people at Stanford. But as Jackie was talking about, we don't always know, right? And especially when you're talking about children, you don't know when they're listening. You're not sure when they are listening or when they're not listening. But in reference to biases, things just sort of happen in the course of daily life. So you can read Jennifer's book, and she also has a TED Talk. And I think she talks about this in both places. And I'm going to get the details wrong, so don't hold me accountable. But the emphasis is on the fact that one day she was on a plane with her son. And I can't remember how old he was at the time, maybe 5. And a Black person walked by them on the plane. And her son's automatic reaction was to say, I hope he doesn't rob us. Now, these are two Black parents of a Black child, right? Who actually focus their whole life on looking at these issues, the issues of race, and articulating and helping other people through this process. And yet, who knew how that happened? And so it was sort of a call to Jennifer to say, okay, I don't know if he's listening or not listening, but we need to have a conversation. We need to do better. So it just is an example that, right, I don't believe that people get up every morning thinking about how to do bad things to other people, and certainly people who are Black. And yet I do believe that there are any number of people who do that. But in the general public, I don't believe that's true. But it's just to say that we have to work on it, and we have to work on ourselves. So Harold, would you have anything to add in reference to your hopes for today and frustrations perhaps that you have or concerns that you may have about this moment?
Well, it's a hard act to follow with Mr. Head and Dr. Copeland, but I'm going to do the best that I can.
You can.
I can say, I guess for me, Ms. Coleman, as you said, I don't live well without a feeling of hope. You might as well just stay in the bed. I like that statement on your behalf. So that's where I'm coming from on this conversation, as I've told everybody. And so I think some of the hope that I believe in today, I was watching CNBC this morning, and that's always a fun channel for me as I get ready to come to work. And there was this huge notice about a female becoming the CEO of Citibank, one of the big money centers, B of A, Wells, Chase, and of course Citibank. This was, unbelievable. She's being promoted from within. And it was a big deal. And I thought, well, that helps, because when I describe minorities, there's women, there's different shades of minorities. We've talked a lot today about African Americans, but there's Asian, there's brown, Indian, and like. And after since being in California since the 1950s, this is a much more diverse state. It is not what it used to be, and there's more folks with different backgrounds that are coming. So that gives me great hope. And to hear that story today about this woman, going to that role, I never did know that. And we still got a long ways to go, and so that's a win for me. Some of I think that will help us as we get more folks out there and they hear the story. I've got 2 daughters, so I'm rooting that people don't look at people as, oh, the black female, but hey, that's just 2 folks by their name. That's what I'm hoping for. I think the challenge for me is that right now, my wife and I, we were just yesterday, she was on a DEI panel, and we were really bragging. This is really a big deal. We're being asked, and here I am today among some distinguished guests. I mean, this is unbelievable. So I think it's out there now. My fear is, and I'm hoping and praying like everyone else for a vaccine, I think that's what's going to help us in this time. But it causes people to lean in and listen, because there's not a lot to do. Now, unless you like basketball or football tonight or something along those lines. And I don't want to talk about sports on that piece. But while we have the audience, that's a win. If there is a cure down the road and people go back to normal and are out doing things, my fear is that people may forget this conversation and that it goes back to what it is. But for today, I am very hopeful within my industry. I'm part of the African American Credit Union Coalition. That was an entity that was floundering to attract more African Americans to our ranks in financial services. And many of our larger credit unions, we're about a $500 million credit union, but an $18 billion credit union just made a pledge of $500 million for that organization over the next 5 years. That gives me hope. That is putting money on the table. So again, it's what happens after we all go back, after the virus is, I think someone said, there will be a cure, and what will happen afterwards. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Cole.
Thank you. James, has anything changed for you during this time relative to how you spend your time these days? I mean, other than the fact that that we're all sort of sequestered, but in terms of how you're spending your time, and in terms of being a Black leader during this time.
I'll take the second question first. For me, there's been a heightened sense that because I'm a Black leader, everybody thinks I know what the Black community is thinking and what the Black community wants. I find that both interesting, but also challenging because in many ways, Black people, I think, have as many different thoughts about, what goes on here as others do. I am a proud recipient of affirmative action consideration when I was coming out of high school, going into college, going into law school. And I know that there are Blacks who think that affirmative action tarnishes their achievements and accomplishments if they sort of acknowledge that. And I think that that's worth a conversation, because in many ways, the issue at its core is about opportunity and about equal and fair opportunity and about opportunity based upon the circumstances that we all come to this with. it was interesting. I'm on another board, and one of the questions that the board considered a couple of weeks ago was how many board members had experienced some level of discrimination sort of in their lives. And this was a mixed board that included a number of white men and women, and everybody on the board had a story to tell about discrimination, either based on gender, or based on religion, based on ethnicity. And so that tells me that there's some common bonds to who we are, and that we can all come together. I think there was a question in the chat box about Senate Bill, I think it's 731, which is this notion of trying to do some police reform. And it's a very controversial effort because many people assume that this is about about actually taking resources away from law enforcement. And then there are folks in the African American community, for example, who are in positions. I live here in Oakland, but in the Flatlands, where law enforcement is a very important need for that community, but they don't get what they need. And they don't get the kind of law enforcement people who are committed to the community and committed to showing a level of respect for the residents of those communities. And so we have to get to those deeper issues in some ways. And I sometimes feel the burden of trying to articulate those issues and have people really understand it. And again, and I can't make this, I think, claim too much, especially for, again, my white brother and sister leaders. It would be much easier for me to make some of those claims if I had, not just other people of color, but non-people of color who were willing to also feel that those were important claims to make and to be willing to stand by. And so I think that that's a part of what I sort of seek, as I go forward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Jackie, anything to add to that?
Yeah, for me, it has, I feel this palpable sense of urgency, what Martin Luther King used to call the fierce urgency of now, that from my perspective, working on these issues very forthrightly for a long time, but here we are with many of the same problems. So a lot of soul searching within and with others about what we need to do differently together this time around, so that we are doing our best to at least have a critical mass of people who not only believe in equality, but are willing to change their individual and organizational behavior to make it real. I think one of my concerns that is sometimes I don't think fully recognized is Black people, Latino people, Indigenous people are canaries in the mines of what may be some breakdown of our economic and environmental systems. I'll just use the example of Silicon Valley. It is very difficult for the average person to survive here. And I'm, just as even pre-coronavirus, just because of the insane cost of living, in particular housing, degradation of some public services. We're getting COVID is a big lesson in terms of the gaps in our healthcare system. I do think sometimes our leaders, sometimes our political leaders manipulate this, I think, broad-based concern around just surviving, thriving, ensuring our kids have more opportunities than we do, that I think all Americans share. I think so part of the, and often then people of color, women, queer people are scapegoated. And instead of talking about the economic justice and opportunity elephant in the room, that we're at a point in history where you can do all the right things and still end up homeless.
Right.
Just because you get laid off. There's still professional people who haven't recovered of all backgrounds from the Great Recession. And I think we need to have a conversation about whether this kind of ever escalating cost of living is a sustainable form of capitalism. And I hate to put it that way, but I feel like that's an elephant in the room that we often don't deal with. And it causes people to be vulnerable for some of the divide and conquer politics that we see, I think, at the national level. So I would love, and I'm trying to have more conversations about economic justice and equity overall, but absolutely including Black people, because sometimes our particular situation is not addressed. Thinker who's influenced me that I suggest everyone read is John Powell, who is at UC Berkeley right now. He has this concept that he calls, I think, and James, help me out if you can remember, universalism, but he talks about the fact that there are some universal challenges that are experienced differently by different groups based on their particular history. And as leaders, we have to figure out policies that are inclusive of everyone, every group's particular circumstance, while we still keep our eyes on the prize of justice for all people. So going back to the case of affirmative action, yes, I mean, when I went to Georgetown University, I think they only started admitting women and people of color in the past 20, 30 years. And so, of course, there would need to be some kind of special policies and practices to get us in, given that you had centuries where it was an absolute rule on the books that women and people of color, Jewish people, others need not apply. And then I discovered there was all kinds of class-based affirmative action. Kids who had wealthy parents, who were donors, who got into the school, whether they could perform or not, and pretty much just eke their way by and managed to get a degree sometimes with the, let's just say, the active advocacy of their rich parents. And so there's a lot to talk about in terms of redressing inequality, but we really need to talk about the injustices that are increasingly built in to the global economy, how to get everybody quality education so that they can compete in an increasingly technological society where certain jobs that were how people made a living are unavailable now, and they don't pay living wages. So I hope this is an opportunity for that broader conversation about economic justice and inclusion, because I think that's the final frontier of the civil rights movement.
Interesting that you mentioned affirmative action. And I think actually James mentioned it as well, and I think Harold mentioned it earlier. We have a question from the audience, from Nicole, that basically is talking about the disagreements in conversation around affirmative action. And I've heard some of those disagreements as well. And I have my own opinion, but her question is, two questions. Do you believe affirmative action and equal opportunity helped racial equality? And if the ideal is involvement in all areas equally, or in a statistically representative way, what does affirmative action look like today?
Well, I just spoke, so I don't want to start. I mean, but I can. So let me.
Go ahead, James.
Okay, go ahead, James. Why don't you start it? And
James.
Harold mentioned it earlier too.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great set of questions. Um, I think in its purest form for me, affirmative action actually is the ability to take into account the full history and living experience of people in making decisions related to who gets certain opportunities, and it includes a real understanding of the value of diversity in terms of that. What it looks like in its most effective form, I'm not quite sure about, because I don't think we've gotten to that place. I think that what it does do, if it is working correctly, is that it actually creates an atmosphere and an environment for decision making that drives policymakers who are making those decisions in a direction in which they are trying to achieve the greatest level of diversity within the environment, because culturally they feel that that is important. But they're also taking into account individual issues within the backgrounds of people who are trying to get admitted to certain opportunities, that does actually value how those experiences for those individuals may have been limited by circumstances that were beyond their control. And those include past policies. They include, and the example I would give is that they can go all the way back to the fact that many people who send their kids to college, ourselves included, depend on the ability to do that by raising resources for that. And part of what many families do is they use their homes, because they have equity in their homes, as a part of the ability to do that. For people of color, because of policies that were passed, in the 30s and 40s that prohibited us from actually owning homes, or if we did own them, that really redlined or discounted the value of those homes, so that we didn't achieve equity as quickly. That is less of an opportunity and ability to utilize and do. And so my sense is that an affirmative action policy takes into account the fact that that occurs, so that when you have kids who maybe don't, and the parents don't have fully the resources for them to come to college, that it allows for some level of compensation or correction of that, so that it can happen.
Jackie, Harold, anything to add?
Well, I think, I heard Mr. Head mention, just to touch on my own business, I think home ownership is a huge piece. You talk about affirmative action, and for whatever reason, I might be tainted. I think of Alan Bakke trying to get into UC Davis back in the 70s. I'll date myself there, for those of you that remember. And that's when affirmative action took a little bit of a turn, as my memory recalls, here in California. And so that was the education system. But I do believe, and Mr. Head just mentioned, I think home ownership is a huge source of wealth building. African Americans as a whole have lagged in that area for many years. Many of you may remember Frank Brains, who ran the Federal National Mortgage Association back during the Clinton administration, that many blamed for getting us in the overheated housing environment. I believe, while that doesn't say affirmative action that we have to promote home ownership, there's many wonderful programs that our government has. I think affirmative action is important to have on the table, because it does set the framework, as Mr. Head had said. But I think we need to also promote the programs that exist that may not be titled affirmative action. First-time homebuyer programs that help one to build wealth. And to turn to your left or to your right and to encourage people, don't pay a landlord to rent. Get in with 3% down, 5% down, or 0% down. There's some big time players on the phone. One of our sponsors, Fremont Bank, they have a great program. Most recently, during this COVID situation, that we look at SBA, we look at EIDL loans, we look at the PPP program. And when those opportunities present themselves, it's important for us to flock to those opportunities when they present themselves, for, especially for people of color, because they may not be aware. And there's many small businesses that are out there. And if they can, if I own a business, I'm making money, and if I'm making money, I can buy a home, I can help to build wealth, and it's the stair-step effect. And affirmative action is a bridge to that, starting mainly in the education community and with some large government type employers and the like. But we have very many small businesses, and affirmative action is not going to apply. In fact, it's switching. That small business is what's the driving engine in our society. It frames it, but let's also use some of the other programs that exist. Thank you.
And Caretha, let me add two things if I can. One is, if Harold calls me Mr. Head again, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm sure I'm older than him, but I don't think I'm probably that much older than him.
Hey, I'm trying to be proper. You had the green jersey on the back of your wall, so I wanted to be proper here.
Yeah, okay. But
yes,
the
James.
second is that in many instances, the issue, for example, on the education side of this, and I know that there are those who are in opposition to Prop 16 because the words that get thrown around are that it sort of it has some negative influence on meritocracy and who's actually qualified. And and to me, the heart of the issue is that we should have an education system, higher education system, in which every person who wants to go to college has the opportunity to go to college. That is the issue. And in many ways, the affirmative action conversation and discussion gets to sometimes be a little bit of a side issue to the notion that we are not willing to open up our education systems to all our children, regardless of race, sexual orientation, gender, religion. And so we have to continue to move in that direction. Affirmative action is one tool for an equalization of that, for getting people who make those policy decisions to be able to make them in the context of a fuller set of information about who's applying versus information that is really limited. And that's the same on the business side. It allows for businesses of color to actually compete with non-businesses of color based upon a wider range of factors, including the fact that many minority businesses, and Harold, I think, would attest to this, have not had the opportunities that non-minority businesses have had. And if given the opportunities, could perform as well, if not better, than other businesses.
Yeah, and I agree with everything's been said, but putting it in the context of also the topic that we're discussing today, in some ways, even if you look at the writing of our Constitution, our entire history has been an affirmative action program for white males who owned land. I mean, just think about the Constitution's Bill of Rights was not applicable to all Americans, to Native Americans, to women, to Black Americans. It only originally applied and very explicitly said to landed white males. And so some sort of affirmative, inclusive action has been needed from the day we created this country to ensure that its inspiring promise was available to all. And that will not just passively happen for women who have been the most major beneficiaries of any type of affirmative action program, and not just women of color, because our metrics are still not that good, but also white women. And so for me, affirmative action has been an effort, whether there's particular policies at educational institutions or in government have needed to be refined or not. It has been a corrective to our racial and gender caste system in the US. And we're not the only country. I work in India quite a lot. And so there are a whole range of very similar policies in India and Brazil, where I work, to deal with their social historical stratification and discrimination against certain groups as well. So I think that countries that do not start off with the equitable democratic principles that they often have on paper in their constitutions need to take some proactive, affirmative measures to create a better society. And then, so I just want to say, for me, it's important to keep that framework in place. Mm-hmm. And I will just give a personal example. 2-3 years ago, I bought a house in the East Bay, and my realtor warned me that some of the documents, although they're illegal and are not applied today, still have the covenants. And imagine me signing, going to closing, and reading the document from the 1940s, 50s, into the 60s and the 70s in some cases, that explicitly say that by buying this house, you warrant that it's not being sold to a Black person. I mean, this is common, and I bet you Black people on the call, especially those who live in what are still predominantly white areas, it doesn't apply, but it's a stark reminder of how your American family sees you. And I do want to share that emotional level of it, because I do think there's a degree of trauma that can accumulate in our children and our adults over time, where these policies and the statistics reach your home. And it's almost like being a member of a family that really doesn't want you, kind of tolerates you, and you're put in the position of at least being expected to justify your core humanity. And so we can argue about what is the right type of proactive, affirmative measures or action, but clearly all of the indicators suggest that we still have more work to do to ensure that the opportunity of America is open to poor people, is open to Black people, to women, to people who aren't Christian or have no religion. And for me, this all is just about ensuring that the promise of our Constitution is available to all people, regardless of your politics. I'm hoping that that's something we can agree on, and then figure out how to do better from there.
Right. Yeah, great comments, Jackie. And I will just add that, affirmative action, I mean, I think this is sort of part of where we are in our country. I mean, affirmative action was sort of the entrance, right? It got people in the door, regardless of which door it was. But we have a tendency in this country to either declare victory too quickly, or declare that something isn't working too quickly. And so I think that's why we have both sides of the argument, because there are people who don't believe it did anything, and there are those of us who knows that without it, there are so many of us who wouldn't be where we are.
Yeah, yeah, you're so right.
And so affirmative action was the door, that crack, but it didn't go far enough. And I think that's really what needs to happen, is we need to build it out, because, and we talk about this relative to hiring practices, buying homes, as you talked about, et cetera. So getting in the door is one thing, but creating an inclusive type of surrounding with all of the attributes and support systems that need to be had to really be able to claim success have not been part of that. And so that's why we see people going on boards or getting into companies and then wondering, why are they leaving so quickly? Because they're there, but they're not included. And that's a whole other part of this conversation.
I think that's true at educational institutions too, that
Yes.
I heard the statement that affirmative action may get you in, but it doesn't get you out. And there are often, you know, special barriers. I remember being in college and being asked to prove that I had written certain term papers because everyone knows, quote, that Black people don't write that well. And I'm in honors English. And so I do think the experience of the Black student and, you know, not necessarily having an environment that supports success is an important discussion to be had also at boards as employees, and that equity and inclusion are critical. It's not just about getting hired or getting into the school.
Exactly.
Caritha and panel, this is Steve. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I know that we're going to run. Yeah, we're going to run a little bit short on time. We've had a number of questions that have come into the chat, and I suspect we're not even going to get to all of them, but I wanted to put a few of them in front of the panel just to see if we can get a few responses to these. And then my apologies to everybody in the audience. We will do our best to do some follow-ups on these and find a forum to get to follow up on some of these questions. This one was from Renee Rubin Ross, who teaches nonprofit board governance. She says that she has students ask, people of diverse races and ages ask this question: what do I do if the leadership, the executive director or board president of the organization does not see the need for moving towards racial equity?
Well, boards hire and fire the CEO. So I think a lot of these DE&I priorities and policies are a matter of the board setting the expectation and holding the CEO accountable. It's really hard to manage up as a direct report to the CEO, but this is a time for the board to do some soul searching and have a conversation about whether they have a CEO that is able to represent all of their priorities, if indeed racial equity is a serious expectation.
Agreed.
I'd like to add on to Jackie's piece is that I think a board should adopt a DEI policy. And if you look around at many, that is just coming into vogue here recently, but I think that that's a good starting point, especially for not-for-profit organizations. Go and check your mission, your vision statements that you're doing your strategic planning sessions, and that could be a good starting point so that CEO, she or he can have that and understand the importance of that guidance. Thank you.
Steve, you have another question?
This one is from Katie Marcel. She says, in the spirit of changing hearts and minds, does anyone have an example of a successful interaction they have had confronting a microaggression? Have you ever experienced a microaggression, confronted the person, and had them respond with an open heart and mind?
I have so many stories that I just, I will give that one to James hasn't spoken in a minute or Harold. And if an answer is still needed, I can back you up on that one.
James, I see your mic is off.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, what I would share is coming into the foundation, we made a decision because we didn't know what many of our donors were on issues of social justice, racial inequities. We made a decision to create the opportunity for board members, for donors to join in a fairly strenuous education process to look at these issues. And it included everything from systemic racism to white privilege, And we didn't know how donors were going to take that. And to our surprise, every donor that we exposed this to actually had a significant level of appreciation, one, for what they didn't know, and two, for the information in terms of it helping them to understand much more directly how these issues impacted, especially people of color, and three, their desire actually for more. And so for me, it is the informational aspect of this that is key to changing hearts and minds. And it is actually, engaging people in that discussion. And as Caritha explained it at the beginning, sometimes a very uncomfortable level of discussion. But I do two things when I try to have these conversations. One is I try to be direct and very transparent. I also try to be respectful of the person that I'm talking to. And in many instances, I will use humor as a way to really, mitigate some of the tensions that may come up, as we go into the conversations. And then lastly, I will respect the person if they decide that this is not what they want. Over the time I've been at the foundation, over 6 years, I've had two donors who decided that the direction we were going in was not what they were anticipating and what they felt they wanted. One was a small donor, one was a fairly significant donor in terms of his giving. And I've learned to live with that. My sense is losing two out of, over 100 that have stayed, I think is a fairly good, that'd be a fairly good batting average or a fairly good point average, in sports. And so really have been pleased with that.
Great, thanks. Steve, you want to maybe take two more questions and then we'll start bringing this to a close?
Yes, I'm chuckling a little bit because I don't think any of these questions are really easy to answer in even the little bit of time we have left.
Okay.
But let me convey this one from Anna, who's saying, I'd like to hear, how can we create a safe place to have conversations? My point is, I want to continue to learn and lean in, but I also find that sometimes I'm met with aggression when I do, because the tension of the topic carries over and in a way gets directed at me. How do I deal with that so I don't get discouraged? I'm being incredibly transparent. So thank you, Anna. And once again, I know that's not going to be a quick answer, but maybe at least one of you can respond in some fashion from your perspective.
Yeah, I've encountered that quite a bit when I've been in leadership positions like James, and my place of employment at the board level and executive level needed to have a conversation about diversity, including racial issues. And I think it's important to engage a skilled facilitator who has a background and a successful track record in guiding people through these conversations. Because these are conversations we obviously don't have enough. People don't know how to have the conversations in a way that they feel like they can truly share their points of view in a respectful, constructive way. And that professional racial equity, diversity facilitator can establish ground rules that allow not for just a helpful conversation, but it's usually a series of conversations so that it ends up building the organization as opposed to tearing it apart. And so again, I think a lot of that starts at the board policy level, CEO creating an expectation that the organization will walk the talk of diversity, equity, and inclusion for all people at the organization, and establishing even ways to measure how well the organization is doing. At my last organization, we had a DEI report card on ourselves that all of the staff and other stakeholders, even vendors, got to contribute to. And then we tracked our progress year by year and transparently shared that with the organization and engaged professional help, almost like OD therapists when we needed it, to do better, especially on the inclusion and belonging issues, because a lot of organizations are moving to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, which is how you treat people every day. So that's my suggestion.
Yeah. I mean, the important things is you have to start somewhere, right? And I think developing some commonality, some things that are, you know, the same goal that you have, et cetera. I think even some of the things that we talked about today, reading the same book and talking about that book and how it impacted you and how it's changed, if you will, or is guiding your behavior, et cetera. I think being able to sort of develop a common language is also very important. So, Steve, do you want to do one more and then, or do we want to close it up?
I think I'm going to go ahead and move toward closing it up and maybe just put in a plug for the fact that we've already mentioned this is going to be a continuing conversation. We know that there's probably a lot more to say and a lot more questions that need to be answered, and we're going to be doing all we can to take what has been started here today and make it part of a continuing conversation. I think Kathy may share a little bit more of that in her closing as well, but thank you.
Okay, great. Well, please help me thank our panelists. They won't be able to hear you, but they'll be able to see you clapping. So please, Jackie, Harold, James, wonderful job. Thank you for your time this morning again. I owe you. Remember, I guess, in my closing comments, that we have to first acknowledge that racism exists. And then we have to get involved and figure out how we're going to get involved. But we also have to get involved, as been mentioned this morning, you know, and I think Harold said it first, we have to get involved with organizations that are fighting it. And at the risk of seeming political, we have to vote. We have to vote. We have to elect leaders and policymakers who won't reinforce or support structurally racist policies. Another book that I would refer you to is The Color of Law. It's amazing what you will learn historically about part of how we got here are the facts of people who determined our place, the place of Black people in America. So understand that we want to do good, but even when we have good intentions, we can still cause racial harm. And I think that's the nuance that we really didn't spend a lot of time talking about this morning, but it is one of those unintended consequences on the negative side. The most important thing, though, is action. So if you see something, say or do something, because until we start paying attention to the content of one's character versus the color of their skin, racism will have its place in our world, but it'll be sad, and it'll be an unjust world. So ask yourself, you know, as John Lewis used to say, are you doing everything you can? Because it's never too late to do the right thing. So thank you very much. And Kathy, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Caretha, and thank you again to everybody for participating. Please help me thank our sponsor again, Fremont Bank, and Rochelle Wright for her opening words. It's been an incredible program in a really important area. Please, again, don't forget we will be continuing this conversation. We're working on collaborations with some other entities who are working in this area, so please stay tuned. Our speakers, if you haven't had the chance, you might kind of zoom through the chat box because you have some notes and thank yous for that. And again, this program was free. But if you're inclined to make a donation, TVNPA would very much appreciate that. Steve just put that link in our box again so that we can continue on and keep providing these programs. Okay, and Caritha, personally, I want to just really thank you one more time for your patience and your time and your efforts and your passion on this subject and your help with this. So we couldn't have done this without you, and we really appreciate it. It's 11:30. We're ending right on time, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye. Stay safe.